So our webinar today is Conservation Incomes and Farmland Leasing, and we really thank our sponsors here today, Illinois Corn Growers Association and the Council of Best Management Practices of Illinois. So they're the ones that have made this possible. There's three of us here today. Myself, Megan Dwyer. Say hello, Megan.
Morning, everyone.
And she's with Illinois Corn Growers Association, and myself, Gary Schnitke. Megan's going to start us off today and tell us a little bit about what we're thinking about here, Megan.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. Like Gary said, Megan Dwyer. I work with the Illinois Corn Growers. I actually work remote out of Northwest Illinois up in Henry County. Work on a lot of issues pertaining to water quality, soil health, nutrient loss reduction, and today we are excited to be talking about the conservation lease addendums. So with that, Gary, you can click on. Great. So most of you, when you're thinking about a commodity group, are probably thinking things like trade, profitability, infrastructure, but actually Illinois corn conservation is one of our top priorities. So things pertaining to water quality, soil health, climate change are all things we make a significant investment in, and promoting the adoption of these practices that contribute to those. Next. All right. I just want to take a minute to talk about a few of our programs. So a lot of this is driven by our commitment to achieving the goals of the Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction Strategy, which you can see on your screen. The overall goal is to see a reduction of loss from phosphorus and nitrogen by 45%, with some interim goals coming up here in 2025. And so we tackle those in a few different ways. We're always working collaboratively with conservation and other farm groups, in addition to some of our own Illinois corn programs. And a few of those worth mentioning this morning would be our PCM, Precision Conservation Management Program. So this program works with over 325 farmers on over 300,000 acres in central Illinois, and it utilizes a boots on the ground approach with trained technical field staff to evaluate the economics of various conservation practices, which we all know when we're trying to implement new things, ROI and what this means at the farm gate is extremely important. We're also working, we started a new program this past spring, and it's just hoping to start the conversation about what's happening on your farm, on your fields, when it comes to your nitrogen use and potential for loss. And so we mailed out water test strips to every member of the Illinois Corn Growers, and we asked them to test water from a tile, field runoff, nearby ditch or stream, and then provide resources on what those numbers mean and best management practices moving forward. A program that took a lot of work from various groups that was able to secure an actual new line item in the state's budget was the Fall Covers for Spring Savings Program. And this is where you can get $5 an acre off your crop insurance if you plant a cover crop and are not receiving any other public cost share dollars. Last year, those dollars were gone within about 10 days. The program will open up December 15th for this year, if you're interested, on a first come, first served basis. And then obviously trying to implement and increase the number of cover crop acres that we see across the state. So some programs around a reduced cost share program for first time users, and then our cover crop program, which to date has been activated on over 20,000 acres. So pretty excited about that partnership and just doing what we can to help incentivize the adoption of these practices. That being said, today's webinar is focusing on the conservation lease addendums, which is something I'm really excited about. It's been really neat to watch these get developed and then integrated into multiple different initiatives across the state. So groups like the Nature Conservancy, American Farmland Trust, Illinois Soybean Association, Council of Best Management Practices, to name a few, have all really gotten a hold of these and wanted to promote them as much as we do. So they were developed with the University of Illinois and the FarmDoc team to supplement existing farmland rental agreements. And the reason or the why behind this is we found it can be challenging both as a landowner and a tenant to engage in conversations around conservation. And so we are thinking, what could we do to help facilitate this? So developing an addendum for conservation habitat, soil health, and nutrient management. By doing this, we were able to provide some framework and tools to help facilitate these conversations. And then when you're able to look at some of our other programs and combine the economic side of conservation with the agronomic benefits, and then provide framework for implementation, that's when we really see a synergy created and we can see some major success happen. So with that, Gary, I will turn it over to you and we can dive into how these leases work.
Yep. So we are going to do that. First off, though, we got a couple poll questions as we're going through it. We want to test your optimism or pessimism for the future. So
Your
we're looking
prognostication.
we're prognostication ability. So if you wouldn't mind, this is for 2021. So not this year, next year. Where do you think corn prices are going to be? And so and obviously we're setting this up as far as leasing. We're in leasing season where you're going to set up a price of cash rent for next year. So we want to see how optimistic or pessimistic you are over this range. 60% of you have voted already, 64. So if you want to complete that would be a good thing. We're closing the poll now, and here is the result. We're bringing this up here. 10% of you believe below 330. 73%, 330 to 370, roughly where we're at now. So we're going to continue that. 13%, 370 and to $4, and then 5% are optimistic. So over $4, which is where we used to think prices should be, but haven't been there for a while.
I'd also note that 330, 370 is in the price loss coverage program trigger range. So that's an interesting side note to that would be an expectation of those program payments. Anyway, sorry.
Nope. And so what we're going to do here, by the way, we do have a question. Where do you believe FarmDoc leases stand out as compared to attorney drafted leases? And we'll cover that. We're going to do two things from here on out. We're just going to provide an overall overview of farmland leasing in Illinois. Then we're going to get into the conservation addendums. We do that because conservation addendums are add-ons to the basic leases. You can't really use the conservation addendum. Well, you're looking at me like we could, right?
Yeah, and I think we'll answer this as we go through that. Yeah.
Yep. All right. So part one, overview of leasing. Leasing 101, we do have available on FarmDoc our basic leases, cash rent leases, share rent leases, short form cash leases, and then longer forms for variable cash leases. Again, we would suggest that those are a basic point of departure, and that we should be thinking about a written lease. Most of these leases are 1 year in length, but again, they are available on FarmDoc. And right below them is where our new conservation addendum leases are at.
And I just want to make sure we give due credit to Don Euchman, who developed these years ago and has done a phenomenal job over the years of kind of keeping this resource up and available for landowners and farmers. And Don is a emeritus of our department and a FarmDoc, and was an incredible he is a credible member of everything. So we appreciate that work, and I want to make sure we give credit where it's due on that, because Don did a great job of this.
Yeah, and Don, we certainly appreciate Don, and he shows up every now and then.
And he still does, yeah.
So just a little bit more background. In Illinois, 50% of the farmland is leased, which is the highest of any state around us, and in fact, in the nation. Just compared to lease states around us, lower percentages. Why that is just from historical fact. And if you look at our cash rent, our larger grain farms that are enrolled in FBFM, more of their farms are leased than that 50% would indicate. In central Illinois, the middle column of this right-hand side, you see that 14% of the acres are owned, and this would be for grain farms and FBFM, average size of about 1,500 acres. When you get up into those sizes and above, we're looking at 14% owned, and then roughly split half and half between share rent and cash rent leases. And over time, we've seen a movement to more cash rent leases, likely due to the simplicity of the lease. Well, again, leasing basics. I guess this would be a lawyer sort of thing, right? We want the written lease is best, although a lot of people aren't, right? Good.
Yes, the best you can have is a written lease signed by both parties that is clear on the terms of agreement as between the two parties. But obviously, there are a lot of verbal leases, and verbal leases are enforceable. They're just more difficult. And if you think of it, you think in terms of risk. The less you have written down, the more risk you have of potential disagreement somewhere down the road.
And then there is our favorite question that we get all the time. October 31st is if you don't have a written lease, you should be providing written notice to the farmer, or actually the other way around, that the lease is not enforced for the next year. October 31 is the deadline, and most leases that we see are 1-year leases with most leases continue for many years, but they're really 1-year leases or year-to-year leases, and it's rare to see a lease that is over 2 or 3 years written into the agreement.
And I just want to be clear on that point, that the state, that's a statutory provision by the state of Illinois requiring sufficient notice for that lease. And so they're gonna presume it runs from February through October, and then you've got to give sufficient notice. So just kind of keeping in mind, that's sort of the fallback provision, right? You can, if you want to write your lease to have different terms, you can. If there's no terms in there, if there are no terms around that in there, then it falls back to the statutorily required notice and basic operating provision.
So try and avoid that by having a written lease, but if you don't, that is the thing. Lease types in Illinois, and here we're showing the percentages over to the right-hand side are what Illinois professional farm managers use, but we have cash rent leases, and that's a straight agreement where the farmer pays the landowner for the right to land, and then the farmer receives all the revenue and pays all the expenses except the land cost, which would include property tax. Share rent, share revenue and direct cost. Typically in this part of the world, central Illinois, it's a 50-50, northern Illinois 50-50 as well. And there may often be a privilege rent associated with this. We have variable cash rents where the cash rent varies with the crop revenue, and then custom farming. Landowner pays for field operations and essentially acts as a farmer in those cases. Again, where we see most of the leases at are in the share rent and cash rent categories. And again, in northern Illinois, share rent agreements prevail 50-50, 50% of the revenue and direct cost going to both parties. There's sometimes and often a supplemental rent associated with these leases where the farmer pays the landowner an additional 20 to 30%, or excuse me, $20 to $30 per acre. And again, farmer bears all the labor and machinery expenses. We have seen stable rents the past several years. This is from Illinois, for the state of Illinois, is produced by USDA, NASS. They came out with an estimate of $222 for 2020. That's down $2 from last year. That's probably more or less an acre or just the statistical difference going on there. But we've seen stable cash rents for the past several years, and actually coming down a bit from 2014, the highs, but then reaching a stable level. Here is what according to USDA, rents look like across Illinois, and then you can see there in the center part of the state, we have the highest cash rents. I don't know, Megan may have a 256, is that Henry County, 256 over there? So there you go, Megan, there's your 256 value, but that may be McDonough, actually.
Yeah, 239 is where I'm sitting.
All right, all right, all right. I was too low there. I apologize.
Slide either.
All right, but you can see the range in cash rents, and you can almost explain that totally by productivity of farmland. Here's what we saw from changes from this year to last year. Some of our biggest changes actually happened in northern Illinois, and I would attribute a lot of that to last year and prevent plant. Overall, though, you can see some of the changes. There's still, though, on average, there's not a lot of movement from one year to the next, and there are considerable ranges in cash rents. With one of the things that we always note is that the Society of Professional Farm Managers and Rural Appraisers typically have higher cash rents in this environment. So if you're looking at a specific cash rent situation, you'll see a lot of variation around that. Even for the same productivity of farmland, and a lot of that will depend on the desires of the farm or landowner and farmer. Again, stable trends moving forward. We've just saw another round of ad hoc disaster payments for 2020. That's going to help us maintain income levels for this year, and I would anticipate actually rents remaining stable for 2021. And again, a lot of that has been as a result of additional ad hoc disaster payments, MFPs and CFAP for the past several years. And again, those have been very, 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 very helpful. Some of the stats that I've been showing on these cash rents come from the NASS, National Agricultural Statistics Service, and the Professional Farm Management Program, come from the Illinois Society of Professional Farm Managers and Rural Appraisers. Finally, before we get into the lease addendums, just give you a feel for what we're looking at for 2020. You can see there at the bottom, we had farmer return of $104 per acre in 2018 for a 50-50 corn soybean rotation, 22 for 2019, and now we're projecting 44 for 2020. So we've upped the yields for Central Illinois, 230 for corn, looking at a very good year. And in recent weeks, we've seen prices go up. 355 is now our estimate for 2020, pretty close to what WASDE is projecting. 930 for soybeans for the coming year. We got our CFAP payments built into there now, $30, and that might be just a tad low for corn here. But $16 for soybeans. Those payments, as Jonathan Penn yesterday, are based on the 2020 APH yield times rates for both corn and soybeans, and roughly $40 for corn, 30 to 40, and $15 to $20 for soybeans cost. And there you see our farmer return. Those farmer returns are up. But still, if you're looking at those CFAP and MFP payments, they've been absolutely critical in the past several years. So,
and Gary's referring to a FarmDoc Daily article yesterday. If you're wanting to learn the painful details of CFAP2 to the best of our knowledge, we wrote them up yesterday. Sign up began yesterday as well for those new payments. So they've got about 14 billion marked for CFAP Part 2.
So there's the basics of CFAP Part 2 and leasing in Illinois. Now we're going to begin and go through our conservation addendums. But before we do that, we got one more poll. Our conservation addendums, one of them has a cover crop provisions in there. What do you think about cover crops, and what do you think what is the likely of cover crops over the next several years? So we'll see what you think. So it's your poll. You tell us. So one of the things, obviously, that we're looking at nitrogen runoff. Cover crops is very effective at reducing that nitrogen runoff. So
yeah, possibly for Illinois type soils, tile drained, good productive soils is probably the most effective single practice you can do, because that cover crop growing over a fallow over the fallow season is going to scavenge up nitrogen and hold it in the biomass and avoid some of the export through tile drains.
So 53% of you believe it's going to increase somewhat, 28 is increase substantially, and 1% think it's going to decrease. So there you go.
There you go, Megan. Look at that. The work being done by the Best Management Council, NREC, corn growers, soybean growers, Farm Bureau to push the nutrient loss reduction strategy seems to be at least registering with
That's
our
what I want to
attendees.
see. And, you know, even aside from just the benefits of reducing nutrient loss and improving soil health, you know, we see a lot of guys that are able to reduce a lot of their herbicide programs from suppressing weeds with the right cover crop program in place. So just a lot of opportunity out there.
So we got a question here for you, Megan. Is the cover crop coupon program mentioned earlier an Illinois corn growers program or sponsor run funded by another entity?
So the coupon program is an Illinois corn program available to all members, and we partner with different cover crop seed companies throughout the state to deliver that discount to the farmer. The $5 an acre insurance premium program, that is open to any farmer in Illinois that plants a cover crop that does not receive cost share dollars from state or federal funds.
All right. So Jonathan.
All right. So conservation. Let me open this by somewhat answering the question on the screen that came in earlier, and also two birds, one stone here. Also provide my somewhat required obligatory caveat for an attorney. I am not providing any legal advice to anybody who is listening today. That kind of thing, you have to hire an attorney and work with an attorney. So these are very basic guidance. And so what you will find in the addendums is the same with the model leases that we have, is there sort of this baseline or kind of generic set of provisions that should be applicable generally. But if you really want, you know, the belt and suspenders approach on exactly how to set that up, you're always advised to work with an attorney, and your attorneys can draft specific leases and specific agreements as between the landlord and the farmer. And that is the best, you know, that is the best kind of version of the lease. So what we've provided, again, these are not legal. This is not legal advice or assistance. This is just kind of a template, a general model for what some of the basic terminology and phrases and the sort of boilerplate provisions that you'd have in a lease, and then it's something you can modify from there. We'll tee this up just thinking broader, and I think Megan did a really good job. Actually, if you take what Megan talked about and what Gary was talking about on the income side, we really get this big picture of what's going on here, and that is that whether anybody likes it or not, there are substantial and significant conservation-based pressures on farming. And you can think of those in terms of the reason we have a nutrient loss reduction strategy, that nutrients from farm fields are making their way into the water system that impacts local communities and drinking water and recreational waters, all the way down to the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, and the challenges that has. We've seen algal blooms in Western Lake Erie, which is a big challenge for Northwest Ohio. We have got pressure around nutrient losses, soil loss, erosion issues, and then the consumer side of this, from the supply chain and corporate interests around sustainable production and better stewardship of the land. So you can kind of just think of this big picture set of pressures on farming to improve and demonstrate improvement across the board in terms of conservation of the natural resources like soil and water. So again, these, while some people may look at these challenges, I think these are also opportunities for farmers to continue to demonstrate stewardship and help tell a story of what we do on farm fields and how much work does go into soil health and natural resources. Just some other background information. If we think about the Farm Bill and the provisions that help farmers with conservation, and in particular, the sort of, we have the assistance programs on one hand of it, and since 1985, we've had a conservation compliance requirement. So I want to make sure everybody is aware of this. I'm sure that there are very few questions or outstanding bits of confusion since we've been dealing with conservation compliance since 1985. But any federal program requires compliance with the highly erodible lands provision, which means you have to have a plan in place for highly erodible land that NRCS says will help control erosion. And if there's a wetland, then the compliance provision says you are ineligible for any funding from the federal government on that farm if you have drained a wetland or if you plant a wetland that was previously drained. And this set of provisions did get a bit of a heightened notice in the 2014 Farm Bill because for the first time since 1996, that compliance did attach to the premium assistance portion of your crop insurance. Now, it only applies on a forward-looking basis. And for any of you that follow this issue, you know that if it comes to the Title I farm programs and you get caught out of compliance for 5 years, you owe back all the money you were paid by the federal government for those 5 years, which can be substantial. In the terms of crop insurance, it applies only forward-looking to the premium assistance, premium subsidy provision. So you'd be ineligible for premium assistance, but could still purchase crop insurance without that offset from the federal government. If you have questions about this, you are encouraged to go talk to USDA immediately, particularly around wetlands and drainage issues. And just another sort of topical issue as we watch, and I almost put this not necessarily as a pressure, but again, a reminder that there are opportunities growing in this space. Ecosystem services markets and the effort to build a market system to pay for the ecosystem services that come off of farm fields from conservation. So look, if you are saving and reducing nitrogen and soil loss to waterways, there's a value to that outside of the farm. There's a value to that to society. How do we get that built into a market situation and reward farmers for that effort? Because I would say, you know, to Gary's point about the income challenges you're seeing in farming, we're adding costs, some management challenges, and certainly potential risk issues around conservation programs or conservation practices. And so how do we think about not just the federal assistance side of this, but the potential market development that's out there? And so a lot of work is being done through, in particular, through this Ecosystem Services Market Consortium to help develop that. Cover crops is sort of digging that a little bit deeper, some of the challenges we have here. Right, we know there's an environmental benefit. We know there's a natural resource benefit to cover crops, particularly around reducing the loss of nitrogen in the drainage tiles and into the waterways. We know they help build up organic matter and that over time there may be yield advantages. Megan even mentioned the potential that a good cover crop stand can help suppress weeds and maybe cut down your herbicide needs. But we also know that this is not an easy practice to do. I mean, this is what it has been to date has largely been a trial and error method. You know, you get as much information as you can from extension and NRCS folks, but sometimes you're gonna have to try it out on the field and kind of suffer through the pains of learning a little bit. These are often long-term benefits we're talking about, but they're not gonna accrue in the short term. And this sort of reminder of that is really important from the leasing perspective, because we, as Gary pointed out, we're running year-to-year leases almost all of these. Certainly if you have nothing in writing, it is a year-to-year lease, which means how do we work through that landlord-tenant situation in which the tenant may be doing a practice like cover crops that's going to build soil organic matter and improve the soil health, cut nutrient loss over 5, 6, 7 years, but be operating in a year-to-year lease. So that's one of the great challenges that we have with conservation, and that's really highlighted by the cover cropping practice. So as important as it is, you know, the federal assistance side of it, the potential for markets, but it also highlights the need to really get into this conversation. In fact, while we have and Gary's got the screenshot from our FarmDoc webpage. If you go to FarmDoc and go into sections for agricultural law, you'll find all of our leasing forms, including the traditional standard forms, short forms, all of these in a PDF format that you can just use or modify as you need. And then we've got our conservation addendums we're going to talk about here. But I think maybe one of the ways just to sort of step back a minute from all the specifics, right? At the end of the day, a lease is a contract. That's all it is. It is a contract between the landlord and the tenant for renting those acres and dealing with the terms of that contract between you, which means everything is negotiable for the most part, or at least within reason. That maybe one of the best benefits of using these sort of systems and getting into a written contract is that it does push the landlord and the tenant to have a conversation. Discuss what's going on with that field and that farm. What does the landlord want to see? What is important to the landlord? How are they willing to deal with the tenant for such things as the cost and risk challenges that come with it? So this can be a very valuable conversation, and realizing that in our current environment, those conversations are even more difficult than they were in the past. But I think you should be encouraged to think through this as a potential way to work together between the landlord and tenant on what is expected and how it's expected to be dealt with and paid for on that farmland. So you kind of keep that in the background as we go through some of the specifics here. And I don't necessarily want to torture us with reading through a bunch of this, but we want to just kind of focus on some of the provisions and kind of what we've put in place, which goes back to the original point that these are very generalized kind of the basics, right? You can negotiate any of these terms. You can start with our nutrient management addendum and begin to really work through it with your landlord or your tenant as far as the things you really want to see in that farm field. So don't feel like any of this is locked in. What we've tried to do is set up a series of options and as much flexibility as you can do in a pre-built document that sits on the internet for everybody to use. So let's start with nutrient management. So obviously here what we're talking about is how are we going to address questions and concerns and issues around fertilizer application on the fields that are being leased. We have used and continue to use the maximum return to nitrogen, or MRTN, for the acronym preferred in the crowd. The MRTN, which is a scientific recommendation on what you should be applying in terms of the maximum return. This is an economic as well as agronomic matter. Gary, maybe you can keep me from screwing up exactly MRTN as terms of application and the economic return.
Yeah, so if you go on to, if you type in maximum return to nitrogen in any Google web search, you will come to the tool, which is a consortium of Midwest states. Emerson Nafziger provides the data for Illinois to give you a rough idea. And this is a rough idea. The MRTN would be about 180 pounds per acre in central Illinois. And that obviously depends then on prices. So that'll vary some, but get in your mind something around 180 pounds of actual N per acre. So that's where we're at on that tool. And this is where our nutrient management addendum builds off of that idea.
Right. So we're trying to use that or incorporate that as much as possible, again, as a kind of a standard setting mechanism. One of the reasons, or not one of the, a key reason for this nutrient management question, use of MRTN and other aspects around this, of course, is the loss issue. Nitrogen moves through the soil with water, and as that water drains out, it's taking nitrogen with it. So when you put on nitrogen in the fall, for example, it's going to sit there and wait to be flushed out by water at some point in time before you ever get a crop planted. So fall application efforts to reduce or avoid that altogether are a critical part of improving your nutrient management on that farm. So the push for split application and so forth. So as we walk through the addendum, you can see it's, you're basically filling things out and talking it through with the landlord and the tenant. We've got in here different provisions, right, that you can select. So do you want this to be, you want nutrient management, a nutrient application subject to a specific percentage? Do you want it set right at 100% MRTN? Do you want to leave some flexibility? We've got the core nitrogen rate calculator that you can access that Gary was talking about. Do you want to then split this as far as what the timing is? I want 50% of this applied after planting, or I want 25% applied after planting. And again, this is the kind of thing you'd work out with the tenant or the landlord. And here, there's a lot of resources available for how to begin transitioning to that split application and what might make sense for your field and your area. Megan, you may have some thoughts on some of those and how farmers work through it, but you can see in these check the box provisions. So the way we set this up is that you check the provision you want to apply, and then that's what the lease includes. That's the contract. That's the agreement between you and the landlord, and it's really, I guess, no more technical or challenging than that. It really is a discussion around what you as the parties in the contract want to have happen on those fields.
And just to give you a feel, you wouldn't necessarily check these all. For example, you would probably check one or the other, or not at all. These two, again, this lease addendum has a number, and the nutrient management specifically deals primarily with nitrogen. And then we also have this last one. Do you want to include the DAP and MAP that you're applying as part of that? As part of the maximum return to nitrogen calculation. Again, this is a conversation that landowners and farmers can have, and we give some alternatives here for making those applications. Megan, you got anything you want to add at this point, or we good?
No, I think you guys have done a great job. The biggest thing with all of these is just really to help open up that conversation and provide some resources for that. You know, some of these can be tough conversations to bring up, and you know, it's about trying something new and being willing to think outside the box when we're looking at some of these different conservation practices. And so, you know, anytime we can try something different is a good day.
Yeah, and Megan, I think maybe to add on that and certainly chime back in, Gary, one of the things that was not in the numbers that you provided on leasing are how many of those landlords are rather distant from the farm, maybe distant in actual miles, but maybe distant by generations. It may be an inherited land that, you know, they got from grandpa that, you know, they have not been around in a while. So having that conversation and explaining to the landlord, you know, this is why we would put on so much before or after planting. This is kind of the way this nutrient system works. Is a valuable discussion, I would argue, in terms of the farmer, making sure the landlord understands why the practices are used and what they mean in terms of production. And so I don't, you know, Megan, you've probably had many of those conversations about shifting from fall to a split app or you know, increasing your post-plant nitrogen application and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're completely right on talking about our shift and who that landowner is. And providing as much information to make sure they're comfortable in these things and understand what these different practices mean. And I think we'll talk about it later, but, you know, Gary talked about previously how most leases are usually a year, and a lot of these practices are more long-term with that bigger picture goal in mind. And so using these to help maybe change what those basic leases look like is one of those resources and tools available.
Yep. Thank you. And I think that's there's always a value in this conversation, I believe, even if it's difficult to get started. I don't know, if there's anything on the nutrient management piece specifically we should answer before jumping into soil health. Yeah. Jim is
I'll read that. You go on with their soil health.
we got a mini FarmDoc article started there. All right. So in addition then to the nutrient management addendum, and again, these, and Gary made the point, you check the box within it, or you completely rewrite how you guys want to, how you and the landlord want to agree on that. It's just a form to use. You don't check all of those at one time. In addition to it, another option for an addendum is around the soil health component. And this is built out of our best understanding of how farm practices, particularly things like tillage and cover cropping, can impact the health of the soils. What are we doing with soil organic matter? How are we controlling erosion? What are the cover crops adding to that in terms of soil organic matter or the lack thereof, possibly subtracting? We know that these cover crops and no-till by science can add carbon, prevent erosion, improve the water holding capacity, as we're seeing some of these wet spring, dry summers may be a bigger and bigger issue. As well as scavenging that nitrogen and reducing it. So what we're trying to do with our addendum here then is once again provide you a series of options to discuss as between the tenant and the landlord around these potential changes. You know, what do you want to see in your tillage system? Do you want no-till? Do you want conservation till, reduced till? How are we going to deal with cover crops? Do you want to see a winter kill cover crop, something that's not going to survive those cold temperatures? Or you want to see something in there that is going to have to be dealt with in the spring? It's going to be terminated in the spring, usually by a chemical application, coming in and spraying that cover crop to burn it down and allow you to get in and plant. And of course, the potential of an overwinter cover crop, crossing the 1-year leasing line is pretty obvious. So that does add that aspect to it to discuss. Again, just sort of running through the document, and we'll jump to some questions as we go. Gary, you want to skip ahead? What we're looking at: tillage, cover crop, waterways, terraces, anything that's been put into that farm. So if you've got highly erodible land, and this again will tie us back to the compliance question a little bit, where there have been practices put on that field to prevent erosion and comply with a plan, you want to make sure that you and the farmer, if you're the landlord, you want to make sure that you guys are in agreement and understanding about how those are supposed to be kept up and maintained and not destroyed, putting both of you at risk from the compliance standpoint. So these are the kind of things you want to discuss and deal with. And so much of this is obviously going to depend on the field. What's that field look like? Is it the flat black soils that we see out here south of town, or is it something with a lot more elevation and erosion potential that needs that sort of contour farming or the terracing and the waterways and whatnot? So as we walk through this, do you want to see compliance with pollution control and environmental requirements as required by state, local, and federal entities? Check that box. Do we want to see implementation of water conservation and soil erosion practices that comply with soil law standards? Again, do we want to see you follow NRCS's recommendations? These are some pretty high-level basic components that can be discussed and worked on. Check that box to make sure we understand between each other. These are the expectations for that tenant. And obviously, if there's a conservation plan in place for that farm, I think it's safe to say you're highly encouraged to discuss that and make sure that conservation plan is followed. And by checking this box, you would incorporate that existing plan into your lease agreement so that both parties are bound to adhere to it. How do we think through practices? Can we put a percentage of residue remaining? So this is a no-till kind of situation. Do you want that? As you, the landlord, do you want to have the tenant in there plowing up, working the fields in the fall? Or do you want to see that, that we leave a significant amount of the residue from the previous crop sitting on that ground over winter and holding the soil in place? That is, I guess, a way to think through that. Can we, in addition to or in lieu of, do we want to just have one tillage pass? Are you comfortable with 2 tillage passes? If you're the tenant, do you want to explain to that landlord why you think that field might need 1 or more tillage passes, what you've seen as you've worked through that field? Do you want to treat a soybean field different than maybe a post after corn is harvested? And obviously, damage do the harvest and those sort of things. So these are, again, our attempts to kind of capture, I don't want to say the universe. We're not so clairvoyant to know all the potential issues, but we tried to capture some of the big top line issues to give you these options to include or not include in your lease. And again, you've got to check that box to have it included in the lease through this addendum.
And obviously, you wouldn't adopt a 1 tillage pass system and a no tillage pass system. So we're giving you alternatives here. And again,
do not contradict yourself in the
written document. Contradict yourself in the written document.
With cover crops, I think we've tried to add a multitude of things. And I think this is, again, a reminder that cover crops add a significant amount of management challenge to that farm. Again, do you want these things you want a cover crop like a cereal rye that's going to go dormant when it gets cold and then pop back up in the spring and start growing again? That's going to be your best type of cover crop to scavenge nutrients throughout the fallow season. But it is then something that's going to have to be terminated in the spring. So how do you balance that question? And again, we've got some basic attempt in good faith language that is, a fairly standard, not an absolute, you have to have it in there. There's the potential that if weather or other circumstances get in the way, that you as a farmer have attempted to your best ability and in good faith have done so to get that cover crop in there and get it established. Again, you could have planted a cover crop in all best attempts, and it just simply isn't capable of growing. Maybe that harvest was late, but we don't get enough rain in the winter to get it established. And so these are the sort of things you would work through. I don't know. Yeah, you want to maybe go over the
just a reminder that PCM, another project that's run by Illinois corn growers, has looked at the economics of no cover crops versus cover crops, and we don't see a lot of in a lot of cases, there aren't a lot of returns to the farmer there for a cover crop, particularly in the initial years. So these conversations are important to have. And again, there's long run benefits to those. So having that conversation up front is a good thing. And as one of our questioners noted, that there is a lot of survey work that has, and focus group works suggesting that on both sides, farmer and non-operating landlords, both sides of the lease negotiations would like to have these conversations. So we are building this material together so you can have those conversations. And again, looking at the lease addendums may give you some idea of what sort of conversation you wish to have.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, maybe just as much as anything instead of checking boxes on a lease addendum, it's a check the box and the things you should cover in that conversation, and maybe a helpful way just to build up that discussion as between you and the landlord, particularly if you're not familiar with each other or have not had those discussions previously, that this is a way to get that talk started. You may end up just setting the addendums aside and writing your own, and that is perfectly okay. We would not be offended at all by that, would we, Gary?
No, we wouldn't. We do have another
poll. Yeah,
another poll here. Do you think wildlife habits such as pollinator plants will increase on Illinois farms in the future? So take our poll here. While you're doing that poll, we got a couple questions here about DAP and MAP in our previous MRTN. Just to note, DAP and MAP have nitrogen in them of differing percentages. And do you want to, so if we say we're going to apply it at the MRTN rate, do we want the DAP and MAP application to be included in the MRTN or the amount we're applying? So that is the reason why that is in there.
If I get, so simply, right, if you're saying you want 180 pounds applied, you want to be clear, or you should at least have the conversation to be clear whether the DAP and MAP are themselves adding poundage to that 180 total, or is it 180 just on nitrogen application?
Or the more typical anhydrous ammonia application. So here's our poll question. 25% expect no change. 69% suggests, which is a pretty large percentage, 69%. Many farms will build it over the next several years. So there you go. There's our results, and that leads us next into our next conservation habitat addendum.
Yep, and as far as the addendums go, this one has I would say quite a bit less in terms of the specifics, because what we are assuming is that this addendum assumes that the farm land has habitat in it already, for the most part. And obviously it can apply if you are going to establish habitat or the landlord wants a habitat put on that farm. But the questions we're trying to think through here, and this may be one we live with a little bit more and adapt as we go, because we want the landlord and the tenant to talk through the issues around maintaining, in particular, maintaining that habitat, dealing with integrated pest management. Obviously, if there's a habitat there for pollinators and we're not controlling how we use insecticides, may cause some challenges for the very concept of a habitat. So having that kind of discussion may be challenging. Getting it started and getting an understanding between the two of you are key. Obviously, from the tenant standpoint, that's acreage that's not going to be under production. So how does that rent adjust? How do we work through 10% of those acres, 5% of those acres being pulled out and put into a habitat? Maybe there's a potential yield challenge if you have to alter your pest management around those acres, depending on where they sit in the field. And the inevitable is going to happen. I still sort of vaguely recall driving tractors, and I almost always found a way to hit something at some point in some year or another. And so how do we deal with replacements and repairs, and who's going to cover which costs and take care of the maintenance around that? So this conservation habitat addendum is built to, more than anything, to really just sort of open up that conversation. How are you describing the area that's critical? What's the habitat look like? Where does it sit? You can jump ahead. And what are the expectations around that? So mowing and maintenance, ditches and field edges, seeding and other issues. Do you expect the tenant to do this? Do you expect the landlord to take care of that? How do we deal with, again, it's habitat, so we have to think about nesting seasons and other critical times. Here, I cannot emphasize or stress enough the incredible information you can get from NRCS, USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Services. And that's not just because we have a member of Illinois NRCS on the line and helping with some good questions and feedback. But I do think that they do an outstanding job in this state and elsewhere to really help guide youth as the farmer with a lot of technical assistance, a lot of valuable information. And should you apply, there's quite a bit of assistance and other resources out there to help on the financial side of conservation practices through the various programs. So in this case, I can't encourage you enough to talk to NRCS around what is the critical nesting season in this part of the state for this field. What should I be thinking about in an integrated pest management conversation around this type of habitat? Having that conversation up front, getting the technical information and advice from NRCS before you do anything is, the critical, the standard. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And if we can prevent problems in advance, then we've probably done about as best as we can do.
By the way, we don't necessarily practice what we preach there, but we'll give you the sermon anyway. One of the other things that this lease addendum does include is the ability or the idea of establishing a habitat. And if we're beginning to establish a habitat, we're taking out land from production, and that would obviously then require, if we have a cash rent lease, for that to be adjusted downward because there's no longer money, that land is no longer providing return to it.
And this is another point, just a reminder on policy. There may be federal payments going in for that habitat, both to help offset the cost of establishment, help offset the cost of maintenance, the lost income. There may be direct rental payments if it's through like a conservation reserve type program. So it isn't just a net, there's only 90% of the acres, we got to cut that out. There may be some program payments involved as well that you would want to negotiate and work through as the two parties agreeing to the lease on that field. So there's a lot to discuss there that is hard to put it even in a check the box situation. So we do welcome any feedback. For those of you that are using that habitat addendum in particular, if you run across some things that you think would be really valuable to include, we would love to hear some feedback on that, because I think we'll just admit that it was one of the tougher ones to draw up simply because of the wide variation we might see.
So, and we would like to thank our sponsors today,
Yes.
National Corn Growers Association and the Illinois Council of Best Management Practices. And if you have any more questions, we would appreciate or suggest that you submit them. So one of the questions, and Megan, we have actually one for a CCA here, and you are it. Are there any good resources for soil nutrient testing in terms of background or where it gets done? So Megan, I guess I would start with the Illinois Agronomy Guide, but what else would you suggest?
Yeah, and I would say, I guess depending on the context of the question, consistency is key. So if you're going to do some soil testing and you're going to do it in the fall, you want to make sure you are consistent in fall testing going forward. Likewise with spring, when you start doing testing in the fall and then come back in the spring, you can start seeing some irregular results and patterns. Same with picking who the lab is that you work with on getting those samples done. Just maintaining consistency is probably the number one piece of advice there, but absolutely looking to University of Illinois Agronomy or a lot of your major testing sites like Midwest Labs put out some resources where you can find their suggestions on when and how to test, and depending what you're looking for.
So another question we have here, thanks Megan. Another question we have here is, while there are certainly a number of environmental benefits that accrue from additional field operation, may accrue, creating additional field operations without associated other economic gains may lead to increased operating expenses, and that is most certainly true. If we're looking at field pass, you're looking at a $10 to $20 expense, and the large or the deeper the tillage, the more the pass will cost. And obviously we do those, or hope to do those, with some economic benefit associated with that.
And there is a bit of and it depends to that question too, right? You can maybe offset some of the additional costs with, like you said, reduced tillage is reducing the amount of time you're going through that field. That's a fuel and equipment issue. So that while most of these do add costs and some challenges in management, it's not always the case that every one of these is going to add costs, and you may be able to balance some of this out as you work through the variety of options here. Gary,
are you seeing, are you NRCS seeing age-specific farmers that are interested in conservation addendums on the lease? And we haven't done a study of that, but my observation, not necessarily on the leasing side, but just on conservation practices, is that I don't notice an age difference amongst farmers. I see older and middle-aged and some younger farmers interested in conservation leases. So it's difficult to say. I don't know if Megan or...
Yeah, I mean, and it's an interesting question. Maybe we should find a way to collect some data on that. I don't know that we have anything other than anecdotal. And often, your younger farmers might be newer, they might be looking for this kind of resource to help them as they acquire new land or get new leases where they're not as familiar. But I think a lot of it, really is what we're seeing with the cash lease and the more distant landowner from the farming operation.
Next question. Shouldn't adjusted cash rent or proportional adjustments be something to consider in the soil health cover crop and addendums?
Yes, and we have provisions in the cover crop soil health to, if you want to discuss with the landlord some sort of adjustment to the cash rent. It wouldn't be as straightforward as saying, well, there's 5 acres no longer in production because it's in a habitat. So it's not as straightforward as that, but we do have some provisions in there. And again, we always welcome feedback on how those can be improved in terms of, do you reduce the rent? How do you account for what may be a $30 per acre cost to get that cover crop in there and terminated in the spring? And so that's not a insignificant amount of money in a cash lease situation.
Yeah, and that leads to the next question. The cash rent reduction can easily be dealt with through a net tillable acre lease. Well, that may be true. It's always good to discuss those things so that there is absolute clarity.
Yeah, and we by no means pretend this is the only way to get these leases put together. That's a good point. Net tillable lease might be a good option for you. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
No. So another question, do you have a lease or lease addendum specific to government payments? Actually, that is pretty much dictated by FSA or regulations. And pretty much, if you have a share rent lease, 50-50 share rent lease, the benefits of ARC, PLC, CFAP, MFP should be shared 50-50. If you have a cash rent lease, all of the government payments accrue to the person with 100%, which would be in general the farmer.
Yeah, and that's absolutely right. And that's just a reminder that the FSA, those program payments, go to the tenant in a cash lease situation, and that's by regulation, by statute. You have to share in the risk of the production to get the payment. We have not built up anything. Gary has actually yelled at me a few times about how do we think through this? And I'll be honest, I'm not always certain of the best way, particularly in these sort of ad hoc situations. How do you have in there kind of a supplemental that basically says, if there's an unexpected payment that comes raining down on this farm, how do we address that? Because it is possibly holding up cash rent. So stay tuned. We're still arguing through that a little bit and trying to figure out what's the best way to do it.
Well, you just said, how about flex leases for government payments? And that is the issue. If you have a flexible cash lease, how do you put MFPs and CFAPs in there, which aren't announced before?
Right. How do you treat those versus the standard ARC PLC payment, which you kind of book in a different way? So I appreciate that issue, and it's under consideration. I'll say I'm not exactly sure how best to do that.
Do you keep track of usage downloads of the different forms, and can you tell us the stats? The first part of that is, yes, we keep track of it, but we don't know what. We would tell you if we had those information available to you right now, and we'll look those up and see what we find out.
I think we would track the hits and the basic web page usage, but I don't know about any kind of download and then how much that equates into actually being incorporated into a lease. But it's a good question that we can maybe find some more information on. So
another question. This is for Megan. What soil test is best for soil health, not just based on chemicals?
I'd say there's still a lot of discussion around some of the best tests, and I'd say it first starts with what are you looking at? Are you looking at strictly seeing your buildup of organic matter? Are you wanting to see what type of carbon has been sequestered? There's a lot of tests out there. The Haney test is one that's fairly well known. If you're just wanting to do something that's really, this sounds kind of absurd, but something really simple, just to see how active your soil is in general. I mean, you can just go out and bury some cotton underwear in your field and dig it back up and see how degraded it is, as a pretty low investment piece there. So the first question is asking, what are you trying to identify?
Yeah, that's still, my kids still talk about that display you guys had at the state fair a couple years ago with the underwear on the drag vine. It was great. That is a great way to think about it.
So why is cash rented farmland so much more predominant in northern Illinois? And if you go down our state, northern Illinois has more cash rent land than central Illinois, which has more cash rent than southern Illinois. Northern Illinois, that's always a good question. A lot of people that have been around suggest that it has more to do with that livestock used to be more predominant in northern Illinois, and the leasing of cash rent was easier then. What is the farmer age distribution on those cash rented acres? That is high cash rent of acres more common for 35-year-olds than 60-year-olds? And the general answer to that is yes, but not as much as you might think. So if you're a beginning operation, you're acquiring new leases, which tend to be more cash rent than share rent.
And we say we've exceeded our time. Jim is about to throw us out, and I've got a class to teach here in a couple minutes. So we appreciate everybody. I want to add, Megan, thanks again for joining us. Not only sponsorship by Illinois Corn and the Council for Best Management Practices, but the expertise, the technical assistance you just lent us on answering particularly these soil testing questions that we would have had to send to you anyway.
All right.
Really appreciate you doing this.
Thank you. One last thing, shout out to or a plug for your guys' YouTube channel for Farm Docs. Gary has put together small little micro posts on each one of these conservation addendums.
That's right. 5-minute Farm Docs. Thank you.
Yeah, they're great. Watch them. Talk to you all later. We appreciate your time today, and thank you for attending our webinar. Look for them in the future.